Hello, everyone. I'm Milica Momcilovic. I'm president of the World Federation of Science Journalists and editor in the science program at the Radio Television of Serbia. I'm joined with Julian Thayer, distinguished professor, Psychological Science School of Sociology Ecology, Center for the Neurobiology of Learning and Memory at the University of California, Irvine. Sorry for that long one. Antonella Delle, Fave, professor of psychology at the Medical School, University of Milan, and editor-in-chief of the Journal of Happiness. Tom Griffiths, director of the Computational Cognitive Science Lab at the Princeton University, and Meike Bartels, professor in genetics and well-being at the Department of Biological Psychology at the VU University Amsterdam, and president of International Positive Psychology Association. But before we start our conversation, I would like to give the floor to Jon Clifton. Jon Clifton is the CEO of Gallup, the global analytics and advice firm. Mr. Clifton's mission is to help organizers create thriving workplaces, put 1 billion people in touch with their strengths, and help 8 billion citizens be heard on their most pressing issues through the Gallup World Poll and 100-year-old initiative spanning over 150 countries. Clifton is known for his 2022 book, Blind Spot, The Global Rise of Unhappiness and How Leaders Missed It, is a Wall Street Journal bestseller. Clifton serves on the boards of directors of Gallup and Young Professionals in Foreign Policy. Welcome.
Hi, everyone. My name is Jon Clifton, and I'm the CEO of Gallup. And today I want to talk about two things. The first is, how do you measure global flourishing? And the second one is, what is the most significant discovery that we've made over the past 15 years of Gallup's global tracking? The first is, how do you measure global flourishing? Most of the information that we consume globally is done by surveys. So when you think about how governments today report on unemployment, many ask, how is that done? And the way that unemployment statistics are collected are through labor force surveys. Over about an hour, governments ask people whether or not they're working. Like in the United States, for example, once a month, 60,000 surveys are conducted in order for the United States to report on unemployment. Gallup approaches measuring a flourishing life in a similar way. We conduct surveys. We simply ask people how their lives are going. And it actually looks like this. Here is one of the surveys that were actually conducted. This one was done in Indonesia. And this particular survey, you can see that the gentleman that's conducting the interview, which is done in local language, is using a handheld device. This handheld device has no utility outside of survey research, and everything done here allows him to do skip patterns automatically, and it also allows us to get GPS coordinates to this particular individual's home so that we know that the interview actually was where the interviewer said it was conducted. And again, kind of one of the best parts about this particular work is that while many this globally, one of the advancements that we've done in partnership with the Templeton Foundation, with Harvard, and with Baylor is the very fact that not only are we doing face-to-face interviewing like this, but we're also building panels. This allows us to do longitudinal studies and get us a lot closer to figuring out causality. So this is kind of what it looks like globally. In about 100 countries, when Gallup is conducting surveys on how people's lives are going, we conduct face-to-face interviews like this. In the other 40, we conduct phone interviews where we're calling people either on their landline phone or on their mobile. But now that we've been conducting so many surveys on how people's lives are going, what is one of the most significant discoveries that we've made? If you think about many of the traditional economic indicators that so many leaders rely on, we can tell whether or not an economy is growing or contracting through measures like GDP. We can see whether or not a labor force is growing or shrinking based on indicators like unemployment. But what we don't know is if the world is getting sadder. What we don't know is if anger is increasing throughout all of humanity. And what we don't know is if people are feeling more pain, more worry, and more stress. But Gallup has been tracking that over the past 15 years, and now we know. And we aggregate those 5 indicators, anger, stress, sadness, physical pain, and worry, into an index, which we call the negative emotions index. And this trend that we've discovered has us very concerned, and this is what it looks like. Because over the past 10 years, we find that negative emotions has been steadily rising. And this has been true for almost every single country in the world, and it has us very concerned. The research now that we're doing with Templeton, Baylor, and Harvard will allow us to get much deeper into what the causes are of this and what leaders and society can do in order to fix it. Thank you for having me and for including Gallup in this really important discussion.
I would like to ask a question to my guests is actually from your perspectives, your line of work, how do you measure, what measurement techniques do you use regarding human flourishing? So, Meike, maybe.
Yeah, well, given that I try to understand the genetic and environmental influences on flourishing, I need very large data sets. And I agree with Jon, as long as we had him on the screen, that one of the best measures about human feelings is asking people themselves. So we mostly rely on survey-based flourishing measures in large population-based samples.
Julian?
Yes, those large survey-based methods can be supplemented in modern times with real-time physiological measurements from a smartphone or even in person. And these types of measures that we've been working with tap something called the vagus nerve, which is associated with health and well-being. And this ability to index the vagus nerve in large populations has really revolutionized what we can do with in the context of measuring flourishing.
Jon?
So we've been hearing earlier in the conference about how flourishing is partly dependent on interacting with other people. And so one of the things that's nice to be able to do is to have platforms that allow us to measure how different modes of interaction and different structures of small groups and societies might be things that support better outcomes for people. And so we've been developing software that allows us to run experiments that are sort of small scale simulations of social dynamics and look at the consequences of those dynamics.
Antonella?
So another aspect which I think is relevant to understand flourishing and is the investigation of real-time fluctuations of experience. So monitoring the different experiential states people encounter in interacting with the daily environment and doing different activities during the day, and differentiating the experiential profiles based on individuals' reports repeated on time for example, 1 week. It is the experience sampling method, a procedure that was developed long ago, and that is, in my opinion, still underused, considering its potential, especially when it can be coupled now, for example, with continuous physiological measurement. And this is, for example, a project we are running presently, coupling the ESM with physiological continuous measurement.
That brings me to the question how we can generate better data on flourishing with more explanatory power.
Well, I think, as we all described, I think the ideal is a mix. So ideally, you have in the same individual survey data, ecological momentary assessment data, so diary data. We also use data from social media, so Twitter and Facebook posts. And then with some physiological and hopefully also genetic information to explain the differences. One of the interesting things that I think should develop is to do this in all kinds of populations around the world. At least if I speak for genetic research, we're very much European ancestry driven still. We're now expanding, but the data sets become very valuable if we have all the different populations captured with all these different measures.
Tom?
Yeah, so as John was saying, I think one of the challenges is being able to reach these diverse populations. So in particular, the kinds of methods that I focus on rely on us being able to reach people via some electronic means, because it requires having software that can be used to set up those interactions between people. And so that's something where we're limited by who we can reach by internet access or by mobile phone access. And I think those are challenges that we have to think about.
And how we can increase the frequency and ease of measurement and reduce the cost of measurement? Julian?
Well, I think that technology is pushing us in that direction, and the ease with which smartphones, smartwatches, and other devices allow us to collect a wide variety of data, the ecological momentary assessments, the physiological data, the survey data, even performance data on particular tasks, allow us to get a multivariate stream of data that can then be processed by methods that Tom, for example, is pioneering, and help us to capture the richness in the experience that people have in their going about their daily lives.
Antonella?
I agree. I only would like to make a warning about this, because one tricky issue in collecting data through technology is sometimes that we miss the identification of dimensions that are not measured and therefore are invisible to researchers, but that could be important for people. I just draw an example. 12 years ago, we decided to ask people what was happiness for them. And lay people, adult lay people from different countries identified happiness with inner harmony, which was a dimension totally overlooked by current research in well-being. And this, of course, shows that we need to implement technology in psychological research. But we don't have to forget that advancement in science also goes through qualitative studies.
Any comments on that, Antonella?
Yes, I think that the technology allows us to capture the real-time vocalizations and discussions that people are having that can also be used in a qualitative way to assess dimensions, and those types of conversations can be processed for various characteristics that can inform us as well. I think Antonella makes a great point that this research proceeds primarily from qualitative studies initially to get us in the right ballpark, as it were.
Yeah, and I think this is the perfect plea for like interdisciplinary collaborations, because also collecting qualitative data and interpreting it's a different way of quantitative research, and we have to combine all the expertises, and don't forget that there's always more than you know. So you always have to like step over your own shadow and say, okay, I know this, but there's a lot I don't know, and that brings lovely collaborations together. What I still hope for is that we go beyond the mean levels of countries or the mean levels around the world, because I think that masks the variation within countries, the variation between people. So I think that's surprising to me, because I've been in this field of genetics for a long time, but that there's a heritable factor in all these things, so that we don't all have to measure genetics. We just have to realize that people are different, and that it's partly due to genetic background. So we should listen to people, because we can't judge them or say something about them without asking them. And I think it's important to realize that it's a very strong factor. Flourishing, happiness are the catalyst of a good life and a successful life and a happy life. It's not the end point. I think that's a very important finding for many studies.
Antonella?
For me, working in the domain of health, I have always been surprised by the positive attitude of people with severe disease and disabilities. These are usually understudied populations, especially in non-Western countries. And they can teach a lot to happiness science because they have found strategies, not just to adapt, but to flourish under very difficult circumstances that can represent very important examples for the world.
Tom?
So I think one thing that's perhaps surprising as we start to deal with these larger data sets is that the kinds of things that we expect in terms of the kinds of theories we're going to discover are maybe quite different from the things that come out of it. So I think, I come from a background in psychology, and as psychologists, what we're trying to do is to search for the simple explanations for things. Maybe there's sort of one causal factor or two causal factors, and you can identify those. But what happens as we get more data is we discover the story is much more complicated. And in fact, these large data sets allow us to justify complex causal models that help us to explain these phenomena. And so I think as scientists, as we start to live in a world with these bigger, richer data sets, we need to adjust our expectations to allow for the possibility that the things we're going to find are not going to be simple, but they're nonetheless going to be things that help us understand what's really going on.
Julian?
I agree with Tom. These things are very complex, and also with Meike, in that the individual differences add to that complexity, and to be able to parse the variability associated with trait factors, and then of course situational factors also come into play, requires the collection of data that is rich and has the capacity to capture all of that richness. Then the question is, as Tom indicated, how we analyze it and how we make sense of that complexity. And we have traditionally imposed relatively simplistic models onto these data, but I think we have to embrace the complexity and realize that that's a strength, not a weakness.
Can you give examples on how being able to measure flourishing is leading to an ability to measure the effectiveness of different interventions to promote flourishing?
Yeah, so this isn't in the context of flourishing directly, but is in the same context of sort of large-scale multinational data sets. So we, in my lab, use machine learning methods to allow us to augment the human capacity to make sense of these big, complex data sets. And so we analyzed one data set, which was on human moral judgment from the Moral Machine Project. It involved about 10 million judgments that people had made from over 100 countries about different scenarios where they're making decisions about these were sort of what are called trolley problems. They're problems where one bad outcome occurs or another bad outcome occurs, and they're making choices about which of these is more acceptable. And so when we analyze that very large data set using these machine learning tools, we're able to pull out many different factors that are influencing people's judgments, in this case about 70 factors, and then do experiments that build on that analysis to allow us to then identify the more fine-grained causal factors that are involved in that. And so I think those are the kinds of opportunities that we have moving forward as we start to get these very big, rich data sets that are coming out of this project.
Meike?
Yeah, I think it's important. I always follow the same route as Tom. So we are completely data-driven. That provides us with new hypotheses. So, for example, we did a very big exposome-wide association study. So we studied all the measures of the environment that we could get for individuals and put them in one model and let the model decide. And the interesting thing was that after correction of a lot of socioeconomic status factors that came up as very important, which is not new to us, the major factor that's actually kept on being significant after all these corrections was safety. So safety is a very important factor for well-being, regardless of your socioeconomic status and the socioeconomic status of your neighborhood. So I think that's an important way of discovering things because you need the correlation between the different factors to understand what factor is more important than the other ones. And then you have to realize that everybody's different. So safety to me is something different than safety for Tom or Julian or Antonella. So you have to do the next step and create models where you actually weight the safety for each individual. to get an individual load of the environment.
Julian?
Well, Meike, this is really fascinating to hear because, of course, you probably know about our generalized unsafety theory of stress, which is with some Dutch colleagues. And the idea is that safety is, in fact, one of these very basic principles. And we came to this also through analyzing basically empirically and realized that this was a major factor. And again, as you rightfully identify, safety means different things to different people. And capturing that richness, again, is part of the complexity. One of the interesting aspects that Tom brought up is that the machine learning algorithms allow for the examination of nonlinearities in these data sets. And we tend to think in basic linear simplistic terms, but the machine learning algorithms let us know that, in fact, there are nonlinearities in these processes. So one of the things that we have found is that there's a curvilinear relationship between heart rate variability and well-being, primarily in females compared to males. And this was, completely empirically driven.
Antonella?
Continuing with the issue of differentiating individuals and differentiating groups, I think there is still a lot that we can do by adopting or by consulting or by involving in research with their own models, researchers belonging to different cultures. Because researching happiness and flourishing is still very much grounded in Western models. And there are some evidence from other cultures of different views of flourishing based on different values, for example, on different conceptions of how a society should work. The problem with these researchers is that they often cannot afford doing good research because of material constraints. And this information is very often lost, while it is easier for researchers from these countries to move in a Western country to adjust to the models that are typically running in a Western lab. But there is a wealth of knowledge concerning happiness outside the Western world that it is highly unexplored.
So more research on a specific of culture?
I think it could be interesting, based on local models, not just adopting, let's say, validated models in different countries, but allow people to develop their own models.
Yeah, that means that you need to include people in developing the ways of collecting data, because then you get the right measurements in. And then I think the data-driven approach will lead you in the end, then also to the better answers.
Tom?
So I think another thing that I mentioned at the start here is this idea of like looking at interactions between people. And I think this starts to get at ways in which cultures themselves develop and how it is that information spreads through cultures in beneficial and problematic ways. And so there's a handout that should be available, a PDF document that talks about a couple of studies that we ran looking at these kinds of things, where we asked questions like, can you better design social media to support positive interactions where you're getting information from people rather than increasing the biases that people have? Or how do you want to structure interactions between people to allow innovations to spread effectively through populations? And so those are questions that we can explore experimentally using some of these kinds of computational techniques. And I think questions like that, I think, can also be looked at in a cross-cultural way to think about how can we build, communities and organizations that are able to operate in a more positive fashion.
Julian?
I agree completely. And the idea of the cultural salience of these constructs in different cultures and how to capture that is a major challenge. in part, as Antonella indicated, because of the resources that have prohibited data collection in many of these different cultures over the years. So one of the things that it would be nice for funding organizations to do would be to provide us with the funding to be able to go into these less studied cultures to actually capture what flourishing means to them. And I'm sure it will yield some very interesting insights.
So some on-ground research is very important too.
Absolutely.
And I think what also is important is that we then make the next step. The research is step one, but to let the research be used for development of intervention, prevention, policy, you need the local people again, because otherwise you develop some kind of top-down policy that will not lead anywhere if we don't realize that everybody's different and that we need their input. So I think also at the translational part, there are a lot of steps that need to be taken still.
I'm often asked what intervention works best, and I'd say whatever you can get the person to do. You can have the best
That's where it
intervention in the
starts,
world.
yeah.
Yeah, if you may have the best intervention in the world, but if no one does it, it doesn't make any difference.
No, true. And there are already individual differences in doing an intervention or not. So there it's already starting.
That's right.
From your point of view, where is the weakest link at this moment? Antonella.
Well, I think we should work more. We should be more aligned with the UN Sustainable Development Goals, because as the other colleagues said before, we need to do more interdisciplinary studies, taking into account that individual well-being and relational well-being and the community well-being are interrelated. And sometimes psychological interventions can be useful at the individual level, but they cannot be just a justification not to do anything at the social level or at the community level. Sometimes this is something that happens, for example, in companies. When a worker is in burnout, let's send it to the psychologist, but it is an issue of organization, maybe not really an issue of the worker as a single individual. So this effort to take into account the multi-level perspectives in well-being science, I think there are many efforts, but a lot of more can be done.
Meike?
Yeah, I totally agree with Antonella that we need interdisciplinary collaborations, and also we need still way more data, especially in different populations all around the world, as already has been pointed out. But I think if we go in the direction of data-driven science, which I think will give better answers, we first need the data.
So Tom, more data. It always starts with more data, doesn't it?
Actually
Julian.
starts with more money to get the data.
Right.
Okay, fair enough. Julian?
Well, I agree completely. Then, you know, the idea of the multiple levels that are these interventions can take place at, from the individual to smaller social groups to larger societal groupings, really requires buy-in from a lot of stakeholders. And that's where I think one of the major missing links is now is trying to get the buy-in from all the different levels of stakeholders.
But also, if I can say, from researchers from other disciplines, it is not even easy sometimes to interact among researchers. We tend to stay in our niche of knowledge and, let's say, exchanging perspectives or at least working together is already a challenge for researchers from different fields.
It's a good thing that we are here today. so we can
Sure,
discuss.
yeah.
And there is a possibility of networking, and also more multicultural research, more data that is needed, more funding, as I remember, which is always not easy thing to find when you're a researcher. So hopefully that will change. I would like to thank you for being here today, and I think that we just scratched the surface of this topic, and it could, as this conversation can have a follow-up. Also, I would like to tell the audience that all the presentations and Jon will be here, and I'm sorry that we had this internet trouble, but that's when you're having conference online, and it's our normality now. So I thank you all for being here, and I'll be happy to see you again soon. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.